right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to basically welcome you all to our faculty job search prep camp workshop on writing your research statement today. My name is Helen Foe. I'm one of the associate directors at Penn Career Services. I am joined by a co-pilot, Joseph Barber, who will be helping me put links in the chat for all of you. Joseph, would you like to say a quick hello to everyone?
Hello, everyone. Feel free to share your questions in the chat as we go through. I'll try to answer those that I can answer from my end, and we'll certainly draw those to Helen's attention to answer the other ones that are out there as well. So thank you for being here.
Perfect. Thank you, Joseph. Okay, so we're going to basically move on to discussing what our topics are for today related to the research statement. So first, we're going to start off by talking about the definition and the goals of a research statement. And then we're going to move on to talking about the how to tailor your research statement for different tenure expectations at different kinds of institutions. Then we're going to move on to talking about the actual research statement itself. So the different parts of the document in terms of the content, the structure of your past, present, and research, your future research, and how to discuss each part of that. We'll go over some best practices for writing about your research, and then we'll end with some resources, both at Career Services and beyond, to help you with your research statement. So I want to go over some very quick logistics. As Joseph mentioned, I do want this to be interactive and to be helpful. So please feel free to interact with us through the chat. Put your questions in. We'll try our best to get to all of the questions that you have. And just so you know, this workshop will be recorded and it will be shared on the Career Services YouTube page. And Joseph has shared the link to everyone for everyone in the chat. So feel free to bookmark that page. We will also send an email out to everyone via Handshake once all of the recordings from this faculty job search prep camp are up on the YouTube page so that you can go and check that out. All right, so we're going to start off with the basics. So what is a research statement? So it is essentially a document that summarizes your past, your present, and your future research. And it also needs to demonstrate your research fit for a particular institution. So for some of you who are on the job market, you might notice that some faculty job applications ask for a research statement and some don't. And it's one of those documents that it really kind of depends on the institution whether or not they're going to require one. If you're applying for teaching intensive roles at a teaching focused university or college, chances are they're probably not going to ask for one. But a good number of institutions will require a teaching statement. It's a research statement. So a research statement is distinct from a statement of research plans. So you want to pay attention to what it is that the institution is asking for. Sometimes you might see that they're asking for a research proposal. They might be asking for a statement of future research plans, or just a research statement. So you want to pay attention with a statement of research plans or future research. All of that is future focused. So a lot of it, the overwhelming majority of such a document would need to focus on talking about your future, right? And what you will do in terms of your research. Whereas for something like a research statement, it's typically a document where you can focus, a little bit on the past research you've done, a little bit on the current research you're doing, and about, I would say half of it would be about what you're going to do in the future in terms of your research plans. This document is typically 2 to 3 pages long, single spaced, and this is not including any of the figures and diagrams that you might be including. So in a lot of the STEM fields, lots of people have figures and diagrams that would make this research statement a lot longer. So, typically I would say 4 to 6 pages is what we've seen to be pretty common. Once you kind of include those other images, figures, diagrams into the document. But I would definitely recommend that everyone be sure to follow directions. So if a job ad is really explicit about wanting a 2-page research statement, then you'll want to make sure that you follow those directions. And if you have a document that's 3 pages long, you want to cut it down to 2, right? Or if an institution wants a 1-page research statement, then you want to make sure that you follow those directions as well. So how does the research statement fit with the rest of your application? So as I mentioned earlier, some institutions are going to ask for this research statement in addition to a cover letter where you're also going to describe your research. So there isn't going to be one place in your application package where you talk about research. Chances are you're going to be talking about your research throughout different documents of your application file. And you'll be talking about kind of different aspects of that research in those different documents, right? So if you have the publications, right, these are the results of your research. Your publications are definitely going to be part of your CV. For some people, you might be talking about your research in your diversity statement as well. The key thing to remember is that no matter how many places you end up writing about your research in all of these different job documents, it really should paint a coherent picture of your research, and it should complement your description of your research throughout the file. So if anyone is reading your application as a whole packaged together, you want to make sure that this research that you're describing, it all kind of fits in with each other. So you want to make sure that it sounds like it's one person doing all of this research, and the projects aren't kind of wildly jumping from one topic to another, but that it's actually all coherent and it all kind of makes sense together. Why do institutions require research statements? So usually it's because the institution and the search committee wants to see if your research is all of these adjectives below. Is your research interesting? Is it exciting? Is it important? Is it fundable, publishable, realistic, appropriate, sustainable, and beneficial? So when they're evaluating your research statement, in addition to the rest of your application, they're going to be asking these questions about your research. And I would say of all of these adjectives, the 2 probably most important ones would be fundable and publishable. If your research is not fundable or not publishable, it often means that this person is probably not going to be tenurable, right? And so search committees are really kind of focused on trying to get a sense of whether this person is going to be tenurable. So by understanding if your research kind of meets all of these different criteria, that's one of the ways that they're going to be able to kind of assess your candidacy. So it's really important to, as you kind of put together a research statement, to be able to ask yourself, right, is what I'm writing, is it interesting? Is this research exciting, important, publishable, fundable, realistic, appropriate, sustainable, beneficial? If you have a no to any of these adjectives, it can mean that the search committee will think, like if it's not appropriate, for example, then it means that the research will not likely be able to be carried out, right, at an institution. If it's not, realistic, then this is a research project that might not be accomplished, right? It might not be able to be carried out. So it's really important to kind of think through whether your research, can answer, can kind of fulfill these different criteria. Okay, so what are the goals of a strong research statement? I would say that there are 2 overarching goals that are related to each other. So the first is that a strong research statement needs to demonstrate the evolution of your research. So, talking about what drove your interest in a particular research topic, where you've taken it, and where you'll take it next. And in the process of kind of demonstrating all of this, you want to be able to answer the so what question, right? Which is basically like, why is this important? Why should people care about this research? You also want to be sure that you highlight your research accomplishments. So it's not just kind of describing what you've done, but also being very explicit about here are the achievements that came out of this research. And then the third bullet point is mentioning your publication and your funding record, which is related to those research results. really important to be clear about what the publications are that resulted from this research, and also what grants you earned as a part of doing this research. The second big goal is to demonstrate, is to show your potential to pursue future research that is independent, different, innovative, and will meet tenure expectations at an institution. So these two components of this goal is really important. The first is that you're trying to demonstrate your research potential to a search committee. You want them to know that this is the research that you'll do as an independent scholar. This is something that's this is research that is different and innovative, and it's going to be basically distinct, right, from from research that you might be already working on, right, in a bigger lab. And the second part of this is that it needs to meet tenure expectations at an institution. So, making sure that whatever you propose for your future research is going to it's going to fulfill maybe what they're looking for in terms of granting someone tenure in a particular department. So those are the big goals to keep in mind. In terms of the features of a strong research statement, I would say that being tailored to the institution is really important. So a research statement is something that can be tailored for different kinds of schools, and what you want to do is you want to be able to discuss how you're going to benefit a particular institution. So it could be talking about, securing grants that you intend to apply for. It could be talking about new collaborations that you'll forge. It could be talking about, mentoring undergrads through this part of your research that you're proposing. If it's a school that cares a lot about mentoring undergrads through research, right? So given what you know about an institution, it's really important to kind of tailor how you talk about your research to kind of fit what they're looking for. The second thing is to keep in mind is to tailor your research statement to the audience of the search committee. So in one of the earlier workshops for this prep camp, I know that some people have asked, how do you know who's on a search committee? Sometimes you don't know who's on a search committee. Sometimes they'll tell you, in a job ad who the chair of a committee might be. A lot of times that information is just not available. But what I would say is that you want to try to glean some information, right? So if you have an idea that here's a job, it's from this department, or maybe it is a joint hire between two departments, you want to get a sense of basically who is going to be on the committee, who might have a stake, right, and who this new hire will be for this tenure track position. So kind of thinking broadly about who might be on the search committee, it's important to to understand that not everyone is going to have the same specialist background. They're going to be approaching this search committee process, from different disciplinary backgrounds. It could be that someone is in the same discipline, but they are not in the same subfield. So it's important to not use jargon as you're writing your research statement, and to just in general make your scholarship as accessible as possible. So kind of with that in mind, if you have an idea of what the departments might be that have a stake in this hire, for example, you can kind of tailor your research statement so that you'll speak to what will resonate with readers. It might be something that you learn from the job ad about interdisciplinary collaboration. It might be certain skills or techniques that they're very interested in. It might be a new direction that they're focusing on within the department. So that kind of information can help you with tailoring to the audience of the search committee. Another feature of a strong research statement is that it lays out very logically your ability to think about your research and to communicate your research as a serious scholar. So it's a document that this committee will also be evaluating to see, like, how do you think, how do you communicate, how do you share your research ideas with other people. So those are things to keep in mind. So I see a question in the chat, and the question is, what criteria would they look for in terms of fundable and publishable? That's a really good question, and I'm actually going to get to it on the next couple of slides. So that's a great question. Feel free to keep the questions coming. Okay, so I know Joseph has an answer on there as well. So tailoring for tenure expectations at different institutions is something that is really important, and it kind of gets at this question about like what's tenurable, what's publishable, what's fundable. So there are a couple of things that people can do to get an idea of how an institution basically views and values research versus teaching. Those are generally the two kind of important areas two areas that are most important in evaluation. So the first thing to do is to check out the CVs of faculty in the departments that you're applying to. So you can gather information about their publications, their conferences, their grant funding, and what I would pay attention to is the where, the what, the when, and the how many. So if you get a sense of, if you look at a CV, you can get a sense of, here are the publications, here are the journals, here are the university presses that they've published with, here are the conferences that these faculty members have presented at, here are the grants and fellowships that they've won. So you can get an idea of that kind of information to get a sense of, what are the expectations, right, of kind of making progress on the tenure track at a particular school and in a particular department. I would say it's more important to pay attention to the assistant and associate director CVs. The assistant director CVs will give you a sense of, what faculty are doing kind of on their way to applying for tenure. The associate professor CVs will give you a sense of, here's what got people tenure. Here are their publications, here are their conferences. This is what got them tenure. The full professor CVs can be a little bit tricky, only because, sometimes if you might be looking at a CV of a full professor who got their jobs, 20, 25 years ago, where the standards for, tenure may have been really different, right? So I would say pay attention more closely to the assistant and associate professor CVs. The other good place to really look for pertinent information about tenure expectations is in the job ad itself. So, I always advocate for reviewing the job ad like multiple times, just so that you can understand, as much information about this position as possible. If it is a joint hire, for example, right, you want to know what departments are going to be housing this position. If it's a joint hire, usually there is a tenure home for the position. So you'll want to figure out like, where's the tenure home? If this is a job that is part of a cluster hire across the university, across different schools at the university, if it's focused on a particular topic or theme, you want to pay attention to that information. If this is a new position that's part of a new initiative at the university, or if they announce this new position because they're creating new programs in X, Y, or Z, it's really important to kind of keep in mind, like, all of that information so that you can better tailor your research statement. So beyond those things, I would say it's also important to do some research into the institutions themselves. So, a good way, a very kind of basic thing to do is to go to the institution's webpage to get a sense of how they talk about research. A lot of the times it's how they talk about research in relationship to teaching. Usually the About Us section of any university page or any college page will give you some information. So even if you say like, oh, I've heard of this university or college before, I still recommend check out the About Us section. there might be information on there that you might not be aware of previously. The other pages to check out would be the provost page, the dean's web page, and the department page. All of these web pages will usually have more information about the research mission of the institution. So I have here a couple of things that it might be things that you find out, right? If you're looking at a provost page or a department page, you might get a sense of whether this is a college that is focused on undergraduate research. You might get a sense of, if this is a college that describes their faculty as teacher scholars. As you're looking at these web pages, you want to know, are there grants to support tenure track faculty for summer research, for example? Are they interested in industry collaborations with research? It's really important to kind of get a sense of that information. Another place to look that kind of answers the question about how would you know if research is going to be tenurable or publishable or fundable, what are those standards, is the faculty handbook. So I didn't put this on the slide, but the faculty handbook is another really good source of information. It can be really overwhelming because those are really, really long documents, but there's usually some information on there about tenure and promotion expectations in those documents. So I would say, if you're able to take a quick look at the faculty handbook, you can get some information, but I would say don't get overwhelmed with those documents. So I'm going to stop here and just see if there are any questions so far that people have. Really happy to answer any questions that people might have. Okay, so I don't see any so far. Joseph, feel free to interrupt if you see other questions popping up in the chat. So I'm going to move on to talking about the structure of this research statement document. So typically on a research statement, there are three distinct parts to it. So there's the past research, the current research, and the future research. I think that having a summary, right, beginning with a summary can be a good way to quickly answer some important questions that the search committee might have. So starting off with a summary to kind of lead off your research statement with can be a really good idea. Usually the past and current research sections can be shorter, and I would always recommend to aim for at least 50% of your research statement to focus on the future. So I'm going to finish the slide, and I see a really good question in the chat that I'll get to. So in terms of the structure of a research statement, it's always great to have section headers and subheadings, which can help kind of visually organize your research statement so that it's easy on the eyes, it's easy to look at. I would always recommend having some white space between the sections so that it can be really distinct. And for those of you in STEM fields, figures and diagrams that highlight your key findings should also be included as you describe your research. What's important to keep in mind is that they are clear, they're legible, and they're intuitive. So I would always recommend that any diagram or figure that you include in a research statement, you want to be thoughtful about why you're including it in there. You want to make sure that it fits, that it makes sense, that it goes in there, that it's easy to read, and that it makes sense kind of in the flow of what you have. And then that last part as you describe that future research, right? It should be as tailored as possible to the institution, because you're also kind of imagining yourself, right, doing that future research at this particular institution. So that is the best place to do as much tailoring as possible. So there are two questions in the chat. So one is, what specific info about the research goes into the research statement versus the cover letter? So that's a really good question. I would say that the cover letter, as it serves the purpose of kind of being an introduction to your whole application package, the research that you describe in there can kind of be an overview of what your past research has been, your current research, as well as your future research. And for the research statement itself, it's just going to be a lot longer, right? So you get 2 to 3 pages, single space, where you can provide more details. You can really kind of spell out, let's say if you have different projects for the future, you can really kind of devote the space to talk about that in a research statement versus a cover letter where you're basically giving the search committee a glimpse into past, present, and current research without going into a ton of details. So I would kind of keep the cover letter research that you describe kind of at a big picture level with some details, but know that you can go into a lot greater detail in the research statement itself. So let's see. So the other question is, how much should you try to connect your past research to future research if your past research was somewhat different from what you plan to do? So that is a really good question. I'm actually going to address that in the next couple of slides. Another question, if my past and current research is my dissertation work, then my book project is my current and future work. And what about an all new research project altogether? Would you say that focusing on the book project would be towards tenure? Should I focus more into the new project? So I think I understand what the question is asking. So for a lot of students, and I would say particularly students in the humanities, maybe in the social sciences, a lot of your past and current research is basically your dissertation, right? That's kind of what you're working on. The future research, particularly in the humanities, in some book fields, is a book, right? So it's usually that second book project. The dissertation itself, usually at many institutions, is going to become the book. And then that second book project is the future research. So dedicating the space to talk about that second book project is absolutely important to do for an institution that requires a research statement. Okay. Let's see. So there's another question here. Let's say, I'm interested in being mindful of the narrative you've constructed for yourself via these materials, but can you count on the committee having read the cover letter before the research statement? So that's a really good question. It really depends on the individual faculty member on a search committee, what document they start off reading. I think that most of the time people start off with the CV, just because the CV is so easily skimmable, and it's easy for people to get a sense of what your what your publications are, what your research interests are, your teaching. So I would say for the most part, people would start with the CV. Whether or not they read the cover letter before the other things, they probably should, because the cover letter kind of contextualizes the rest of the documents for the committee. So I would say that for faculty members on a search committee, it's a good strategy for them to read the cover letter first before the research statement. But ultimately, it's up to them what order they're going to to go with as they go through these different documents. Okay, another question: how do you incorporate postdoc research that pivoted from your major goals? Research I did during COVID is quite distinct from my overarching research goals. So that is a really good question, which I'm going to cover as I talk through the past, the present, and the future research. But feel free to follow up if I don't get to your specific question. How specific should the research needs be? Should I add preliminary data? Also a great question. I'm going to cover that. So definitely. I'm going to cover a lot of these questions, but they're all great questions. Keep them coming. All right, so I'm going to go back to kind of the structure of this research statement. So again, I do think that starting with a summary is a good way to begin your research statement. So the summary is going to basically cover your past, your present, and your future research, and it can be really helpful to your reader, especially if they stop reading. So we know that especially if an institution or if a committee is asking for multiple different documents, that's a lot of pages that faculty members on a search committee will have to read. So you it's not a guarantee that they're going to read everything. In fact, almost certainly they're not going to read everything. So you want to make it easy for them to get answers to some of their major questions about your research. So if you have a summary, it's great. People can read the first paragraph and they might skim the rest of the research statement. So if you were to write a summary to begin your research statement, it's really a good idea, I think, to have a very interesting hook. And one way of doing that is to let the research itself draw the reader in. And so, so letting, starting with the research itself, to kind of let people know, like, here's what I study, and here's why it's interesting. Here's a fun tidbit from the research that I do, right? Or an interesting tidbit from it. So that's a good way to kind of begin. And within this summary, it's good to kind of tell a narrative where you answer all of these questions. I would say typically in this order. So starting off with why you became interested in a particular research topic, what's the major kind of burning question that you set out to answer as part of your research, how did you answer this question, what are the methods and approaches, techniques that you use to answer this question, what did you find, what were your conclusions, and why were those conclusions important and groundbreaking. What new questions did these research findings illuminate? What new questions arose? And then how those questions will drive your future research, and why is that important? So telling a narrative where you answer all of these questions can be really helpful, because these are the questions that a lot of members of the search committee will be wondering. So answering them all at the beginning of a research statement can be an effective use of that space. So usually after a summary, it's good to talk about your past research, where you provide some context and some background for your research specialty. So it's important to kind of situate your research into a broader field, to just explain, here's why this research is important, and here's where it sits, right, in your broader field. You'll want to describe your major research question, talk about your sources, your skills, methodologies, and techniques that are used. If you had encountered any kind of research challenges of any kind, you can mention them. I would say mention them briefly. You don't want to kind of overdo the research challenges part, but you do want to mention them and talk about how you overcame these challenges. Always important to talk about those research findings and accomplishments, especially in terms of publications and grants. And as you kind of talk about these different topics, also be sure to answer the so what question. You're going to hear me talk about this for each of the different parts of your research statement. Answering the so what question is really important. It's trying to be clear about why other people should care about your research. Why should they care? So this past research section can be short, and I would say especially if it's not directly connected to your future research that's proposed. So I know there was a question in the chat earlier. If you've pivoted like pretty significantly from your past research, it's okay to keep it to a minimum, right? As you describe this past research, I do think that it's still important to mention it, and the accomplishments that you had, the achievements that you had with this research, but it's okay not to go into a ton of detail, especially if it's not related to what you're going to do in the future. So kind of moving on from your past research to the current research, I think it's really important to be able to connect your past research to what you're working on now. So having a good transition sentence, right, as you transition between paragraphs, making sure that there is a clear thread, right? There's a common thread between what you studied and what you're doing now. Kind of making sure that that's evident at the beginning of this current research section is important, and then kind of use that as a way to segue then into your research question that you're working on now. Because it is ongoing research, you can share what has been done, what still needs to be done, and also how, right? So that's about the methodology and the approach. So same thing with mentioning research outcomes. if you've done part of the research already and it's, yielded one publication or one conference presentation, you can talk about that. If there's still kind of more to do, it's okay to kind of, you can gesture towards what you will be doing, where you will be publishing, with the remaining research that needs to be done. Again, the so what question is really important to answer. So stating the significance and the implications of this research to your field has to be very clear in this part. So as you move on to talking about the future research, so there's a lot more to include in this future research section. So again, the thread needs to be clear. How does it all kind of logically tie together between your past, current, and future research? So you'll want to explain how your future research agenda basically stems from prior and current research that you've done, but is also distinct, important, and groundbreaking and innovative. And particularly for those of you who are in the STEM fields, it's important to highlight how the research that you're proposing is going to be distinct from your PI's research. And for a lot of people, what we see in strong research statements is also some indication in the statement itself that you have discussed, taking this aspect of your research and turning it into your own lab, that you've discussed this plan with your current PI, or that you've gotten permission from your PI to go and develop this aspect of research, right, into a longer term project. So that part is really important so that you can be clear that you are going to be an independent scholar. You're not duplicating research that's currently done, by your PI or by others in your lab. So that part of it is really important as well. So kind of making sure that the importance and the innovation of your research, of your future research, is important, while also kind of demonstrating the independence is really important as you talk about this future research agenda. In regards to actually spelling out, right, providing an overview of those major research goals and questions for the next 3 to 5 years, it's important to be clear about how you're going to kind of address and achieve those goals and answer those questions that you're proposing. So the time frame that I have here is about 3 to 5 years. I would say that's a good timeline to kind of of research to kind of include in a research statement. And the reason for that is 3 to 5 years, I would say closer to 5 years, that is the amount of time that that you'll be able to demonstrate your research and carry out your research before you get evaluated for tenure. So for those of you who attended some of the panels from yesterday with the faculty, you might know that depending on the institution, you might have to submit your tenure file with everything that you've ever written, everything that you've ever published. At the end of your 5th year or your 6th year, it really depends on the institution. So that's why having a research statement that covers the next 3 to 5 years of what you intend to do is really important. It's also really helpful to be clear and to state what your immediate short-term goals are, as well as those longer-term plans. So by short-term goals, I mean, what are you going to do as soon as you get hired, right? So let's say that first semester that you get hired in an assistant professor role at this institution, what are your goals going to be for those, let's say, 6 months or that first semester? And the reason for that is almost all search committees want to know how you're going to be able to hit the ground running if we were to hire you, right? If we were to hire you, do you have a plan and do you know exactly what you're going to work on? So talking about those short-term goals can help alleviate those concerns that they might have, about what you're going to be able to do if we were to hire you. And those longer-term plans are also important so that they get a sense of what are you going to do over the span of a couple of years before evaluation for tenure. For describing your overall kind of research goals and questions, it's helpful to keep the big picture in mind. So yes, you want some details, but the big picture is usually what what faculty will kind of take away, right, as they read your research statement. So you want to keep in mind the big picture as well. Along with that, it's again answering that so what question. Why should people care about this research? What's important about it that they should care, right? Um, there isn't a need to actually include every side project that you can envision. And I think sometimes having too many projects that you propose for the future can make the candidate seem a little bit distracted. So it's usually a good strategy to have a primary project that you're selling, that you're writing about in your research statement, and then to integrate other aspects of it and to maybe sell it as like a bonus, right? Here's this bigger project, and here's something that might result from it that is a bonus to to your overall bigger picture research goals. Okay. So future research in terms of, I know there was a question earlier in the chat about including preliminary research findings. So if you've kind of started already working on on a future project and you have some preliminary data from it, it's always good to mention it and to include it in your research statement. And you can talk about how you can then build on these results for the future. And that's a really good strategy because it makes you even more credible, right? When you have said, here's what I'm proposing to do in the future. And by the way, I've already started, I have some preliminary data, and here's how I'm going to use it for the future. So it makes your future research all the more believable and the more convincing that it's realistic and that you can actually carry it out. So definitely that's a great thing to do if you happen to have preliminary research that you've already done. As you talk about your future research, you also want to outline what are the needs, what are the things that you need to actually carry out your research, right? It could be certain software that you envision using. It could be access to archives. It could be access to certain kinds of equipment. So you want to be clear about what it's going to take to do your research. Again, I think it adds to being able to tell a compelling story and convincing story of how you're going to do the research, because it shows the committee that you've thought through what the needs are in order to carry out your research. One thing I'll say is that you probably, even though it's important to talk about those research needs, it's probably best to avoid being too specific in terms of like what things are going to cost. And in fact, it's a better strategy to save a detailed budget for what you will need for your research for a later stage of the process. So usually at the interview stage, some institutions might ask you for a research budget or a startup budget. So that's a better place to kind of talk numbers, because generally you don't want to engage in any type of negotiations before you get an offer. Some institutions might ask for that budget at the interview stage, which unfortunately is common. But I would say definitely to avoid any kind of numbers or anything like that as you write your research statement. A huge important thing to keep in mind as you write about your future research is to discuss your external funding and publication plans. And for this part, like you have to be very specific in terms of what are the external funding sources that you're going to apply for. If there is a particular grant within this agency that you're looking at, you want to be able to name them and to be very specific. If you have publication plans, I'm thinking more kind of along the lines of the humanities, for example, if you are thinking about having some of your work with a series within a university press, right? All of that is really helpful for the search committee because it shows them that you've thought through, where's your research going to be published and where is it going to be funded, right? So being as specific as possible is going to help your case in terms of presenting a really compelling research agenda. So this last part of talking about your future research, as I mentioned earlier, should be tailored to the institution as much as possible. And you want to tailor it in a way so that your research is going to be feasible, realistic, and appropriate. So what that boils down to is, talking about if there are, centers or institutes on campus, if there are other departments or schools, if there's technology or equipment that you would take advantage of, that you would collaborate with, in terms of facilities and resources on campus. It's a great thing to mention, right? Because it demonstrates to the search committee that you've done your homework, you know what's there, and it gives them an idea of how you're going to basically engage with all of these other potential partners on campus. More specifically, if you are in a field where collaborating with faculty is really important, naming specific faculty that you envision working with is also really crucial to present a compelling and convincing case that you've done your research and you know that your research is going to fit well within the department if you know specific faculty members to work with. So another way of basically tailoring to the institution as well is by mentioning their students and trainees. So graduate students, undergrads, postdocs. If you know that an institution is geared towards undergraduate research, for example, then maybe being explicit about this part of your project that can be done, right, as you teach undergrads and mentor undergrads, can be a good idea as well. So at the end of this section on the research, on the future research, and also basically the end of your research statement, it's a great idea to end on a high note. So summarizing what you're excited to contribute and to bring to this campus, to the institution, to the department. And sometimes, using I think can be using, first person pronoun can be really helpful to just kind of sum up just how excited you are and how much you're looking forward to, to the prospect of joining the department and what you'll bring. So that's a good way to kind of end it on a high note. I have a couple of other slides, but I do see some questions here. I know that Joseph has answered some of them, but I'm gonna stop for now, and maybe I'll check in with Joseph to see if there are other questions that might be worth kind of discussing.
So some of the questions relate to this idea of a single, research project that you're trying to showcase versus, a range of different projects that are out there, and some of the advice is that you want a project that's easy to start and one that you're building on, and then maybe stuff in the future. And how is that distinct from, the advice that you're sort of sharing, which is to sort of focus in on a particular single project? And I guess what I was trying to get across in one of my chats is that there may be a research theme that you're trying to get the community excited by, and there could be different projects that intersect with that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to sort of manage the sort of the singular versus multiple research ideas that you might be able to present in a research statement.
Yeah. So I think I think the key here is to kind of be able to, I think, prioritize. I think one of the benefits of having a one bigger project that you're selling and then other projects that kind of complement it and integrate and intersect with it, is that it's really clear kind of what your overarching kind of research goals are going to be centered on. I think that having that way of presenting your research can be really helpful to just signal that this is the priority and that all kind of fits in, everything ties in together, and it's all relevant, even though there might be other parts of the research that will be slightly distinct, but it's all kind of still tying into this coherent theme of research. I think that for some fields, I will say, I think for some fields, it is more common for people to propose kind of different projects that are different from one another, and maybe it's not so common to have one big project. But I think at the end of the day, it's still kind of important to kind of prioritize the different projects so that the committee can know, right, what is most important to you, and how should they kind of see how you rank the order of importance of all of these different projects that you're proposing. Joseph, are there other things that you would add to this question?
But I think that last point is very important. The idea is that they need you to tell them what you're doing rather than you saying, here are things I can do. Because if you sort of present a whole range of options, it's almost as if you're saying, and tell me which one of these is most exciting to you or which is most important. And that's to a certain extent, a student experiences with research. They suggest projects, and then advisor might say, well, this one looks like the best one. So presenting a very confident perspective of this one needs to be done, this is important, this is impactful, that's going to really sell the idea that you're able to do independent research without someone being there to support you. You may have mentors, you may have collaborators, but you are the one who needs to drive that.
Okay. So I see there are other questions in the chat too. I'm going to answer a couple of these that I see. So what is, do you recommend first person pronouns throughout or just in the conclusion? That's a good question. So I get to this in a couple of slides, but generally, it's not, you don't want to overdo the first person pronoun and use I kind of all throughout, I would say, because at the end of the day, this is still like a pretty formal document. It's not a personal statement per se, but I do think using first person can be really helpful. One, to establish that research independence, right? It's using I versus we, but also I think using I can be helpful in conveying how you're personally excited, right, about this research, or how you were personally invested in pursuing this line of inquiry in your research. So I do recommend using it strategically, probably in the summary and in the conclusion, but I wouldn't overdo it. But that's a very, very good question. There's another question here. Are there sample research statements available? So there are a couple of sample research statements in the Academic Job Search Handbook, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides as I mentioned some of the resources that are available to all of you. So it's kind of, these are sample research statements that anyone can get access to in the book. We don't have sample research statements, mostly because these are documents where people that contain people's intellectual properties, and I think for that reason it's hard for people to kind of share those out with a wider audience. So but there are some that I will share kind of as I talk about the resources towards the end. Okay, so I see that Joseph had answered a couple of other questions. Joseph, are there other questions that we should talk about before I cover the next couple of slides?
No, I think if we get to some of the resources as well as the last few slides, then if they're not covered there, we can cover those at the end.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk really briefly just about the flow of a research statement. So as you put together your research statement and kind of read over it, the question of flow, right? How does it flow? I think it's something that is important to think about. So as you read it through from beginning to middle to end, you want to get a sense of whether your research, the way that you describe your research, follows logically from the past to the present and then to the future. Like it should kind of make sense that, again, there's a thread that unites these three parts of research. You want to make sure that you're building upon new skills and knowledge, throughout the different paragraphs. The question of voice, I think, sometimes can be a tricky one, but you want to make sure that your research statement does have a consistent voice throughout. So one way to think about it is to think about, if you read these different paragraphs separately and also together, does it sound like it's one person kind of writing it, or does each paragraph maybe have a different style? You do want it to be, to have the same style, because it is one document. So kind of reading for that narrative voice to make sure that it's kind of consistent throughout, is important to keep in mind. And then finally, kind of looking at the statement itself, like physically on a piece of paper, to see if it's easy on the eyes, right? Are there giant paragraphs on there? You want to make sure that it's easy to be able to skim, and it's easy to see kind of where the different sections are. And to make sure that you're not overdoing the bolding and italics and underlining, right? Just making sure that the way that it presents itself, the document visually, is that it's easy and it's clear to kind of understand. So a couple of best practices for the writing itself. So again, I do think it's important to keep in mind the bigger picture, right? Because the audience might not be specialists in your field, and it's going to be the bigger picture research agenda that's going to resonate with them. Don't undersell yourself. I think, with all documents in the faculty job search, you definitely don't want to undersell yourself, but I would say with the research statement, this is a document where you definitely should not undersell yourself. And this is the part where you do want to be making some bold statements about your research, and about how innovative and groundbreaking it is, and why it's important for other people to pay attention to. Avoiding jargon, very important to do. Again, keeping in mind that not everyone is going to understand, the very specifics, right, of your subfield, and of your projects in particular. So making it easily accessible. Along the lines of good writing in general, it's making sure that you vary your sentence structures and lengths, so that it is interesting to read, right? It doesn't seem boring to read if it's kind of like the same structure for every sentence. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but using first person strategically, particularly for people who are in the STEM fields, it's really important to use the first person pronoun. So using I to clearly explain, this is what I did, right? As a postdoc, or this is what I did as a graduate student, that is distinct from what the whole lab is doing, right? So using first person strategically helps you to create this narrative of your own independence as a scholar. So making sure that that you are cautious, and aware, basically, of when you use the word we, right, as distinct from I, as you describe what you've done in the past. Citing strategically is also really important. So, a research statement is not a grant proposal, right? It's not a journal article. So it's kind of this unique document where, you do want to be strategic when you cite. So cite the most important things. And if you have an idea of what the search committee might care about, you might kind of keep that in mind as you decide what to cite in your statement. But I would say, and you can also kind of abbreviate the citations, but it doesn't need to be a whole long, page of citations that you include with a research statement, right? Because again, it's not a grant proposal. Making sure, and this is a really, really important point, and something that everyone should do, when you write a research statement, is to make sure that you do ask your faculty and your colleagues, so both specialists, within your discipline, non-specialists within your discipline, maybe even people outside of your discipline, to review and to provide feedback, because these are the people who will be able to best understand your project, and will also be able to kind of give you really constructive feedback in terms of, whether or not you're explaining your research in a way that makes sense, right? And last but not least, definitely proofread. It's super important to make sure that there aren't any typos. Everything is written well for the search committee. So I have just a couple of slides left. I know we're at 3 o'clock right now. So Joseph is sharing a couple of links in the chat for us. So I mentioned the Academic Job Search Handbook, which it's a book that is available at the Penn libraries and anywhere that you order your books online. A really helpful resource, and there are sample research statements across different disciplines there. He's also shared the guide to faculty applications that we have at Career Services, so feel free to check that out. We do have a webpage that is dedicated to talking about research statements for faculty job applications. So that is in the chat as well. And then I wanted to plug our new resource for PhDs and postdocs called Aurora by Beyond the Professoriate. So for anyone looking to apply for faculty positions, there is a whole module of courses that people can take. These are basically webinars that you can listen in on. And there is, in fact, a webinar on how to write a research statement for academic job applications that you can check out. So lots of really great resources that would kind of complement what we're doing as part of this faculty job search prep camp. And then finally, I want to talk about our resources at Career Services. So we are very happy to review your research statement and your other faculty job search documents. So feel free to make an appointment with us via handshake. I think Joseph is going to put the link up in the chat. We have a lot of appointments that are set aside for attendees of the faculty job search prep camp. So it's all on Friday, August 13th. So all of us on the graduate student and postdoc team will be able to meet with participants from the prep camp. I see a question: are the appointments available for alumni? Absolutely. So alumni, current PhDs, and postdocs. We are all happy to meet with any of you.